Hi, I'm Ray Smith, author of the Real Jazz Pedagogy book, and this is another in a series of videos that coordinate to that book. These videos in this segment are coordinated to Chapter 9, which deals with articulation in the jazz swing style. And I think the first point to make is that rarely can you trust what you're seeing written on the paper. I've gone into band rooms and I've seen teachers insisting, you're not doing the articulation that's written there on the page. See those slurs? You should do those slurs. No, we don't do those slurs. That's almost always a problem to insist on what's on the page because most of the time it's incorrect. I don't know why this happens. It's a deep, dark secret in the publishing industry. Maybe it's a secret even to the publishers. I don't know, because I watched Wayne Bergeron, friend of mine, great lead trumpet player with the Gordon Goodwin Big Fat Band, and Wayne took on all the publishers at the Gen Conference. They were all in the same room at the Jazz Education Network, and Wayne took them on and said, "Why don't you write this stuff the way we play it?" And they seemed to be a little shocked, a little surprised that they weren't writing it like we play it. But they definitely do not write this stuff like we play it, and so you have to be careful with this because you've got to get the students articulating according to principle, not according to what's written on the page. Now, the principles that I'm going to share with you here are ones that I've gleaned over many years of teaching and playing, and have figured out ways to try to get students to do what I think is necessary for the swing style. And I find when I get my whole band on the same page on this, it makes an enormous difference for the tightness, precision of the band, because articulation goes hand in glove with all of the time, feel, and rhythmic issues that we've talked about in Chapter 7 and 8. So I think that having made that point then, the first principle that I would have the students understand is how you articulate running eighth notes. And the way that I typically teach this is I'll have them play a scale, just one octave scale up to the octave, and then illustrate this articulation principle that we tongue the upbeats, slow to the downbeat, tongue the upbeat, slow to the downbeat, all the way up and down. Now there's a principle that plays in hand in glove with this, which is that top notes of contours are accented. And in jazz, if we accent, we tongue, we articulate. And these principles apply also. I've been working with them with a jazz violinist on a number of occasions. They apply to all the wind instruments, but also what I'm trying to illustrate is to the violin, piano, guitar. They can't do exactly the same techniques, but they have to create the same sound. They have to simulate the same kind of a thing on their instrument, whatever it takes to do it. So the first thing we need to understand is that default mode for eighth notes is going from up to down, up to down. We never slur down to up. That would be backwards. In fact, it's critical to know that every upbeat must be tongued. We always tongue every upbeat. That means that I can never slur more than two notes in a row, because if I slur more than two notes in a row, now I'm slurring an upbeat. So we've got to always realize we can only slur two notes at a time, and that we always are slurring, we're tonguing the upbeat and slurring to the downbeat. The top note of the contour would be when I'm hitting the top and then going back down. That note that sits right at the peak is the note at the top of the contour. That note needs to be accented. And so in this case, I'm only going to the octave. Da ba da ba da 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 da. I'm going to accent that, but it doesn't change my tonguing pattern because I was already planning to tongue that note. But what if I take the scale to the ninth? Now I've got one more note up there, and it turns out that the top note of the contour now is on a downbeat. Do 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 do. I'm going to have three notes in a row tongued over the top because I have to tongue the upbeat, and I have to tongue the upbeat, and I'm going to tongue the downbeat, which is the top note also. Let me illustrate these. Now, I don't want to have any spaces or decays. It's very common to have da, 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 a decay in there. I'll often say to a student, play your first note. and it starts to decay immediately. No decay. And we're right into it. All right, now if I go up to the 9th, now I've got a top note of a contour and a downbeat position, which alters my default mode tonguing pattern. So those make good exercises you can do with the whole band. Of course, it's helpful to your individuals to give them the necessary feedback, but that's something that can be used. Now I want to illustrate this in some bebop lines. And in chapter 9 here, I've written a common lick that Charlie Parker does. And I'm going to play this. Well, let me just play it first. Play it one more time. All right, now, there are many things that can go wrong with this, but this is typical to see stuff. This next example, this is by the way, in the book, this is on page 44. It's typical to see this kind of a slurring problem where there's way too many notes slurred. It's so unnatural to do that. Let me try it again. Way too much slurring. Way too much slurring. Another problem that we run into with 8-note line understanding is some people teach accent every upbeat. I'm here to tell you that's heresy. I grew up hearing those kind of ideas too. No one plays that way, period. And so let me illustrate, I should say, what it sounds like if you accent all the upbeats. That's like if I talk like this, where every other syllable is accented. There's no phrasing. There's no way that is a good idea. It's equally bad idea if you accent all the downbeats. Let me illustrate that. Which leads to backwards slurring, and there's no swing, no rhythmic swing feel at all. I'd like to illustrate how we do jazz accents while I'm talking about accents. And this is on page 45 in the book. I've illustrated this. But classical accents have a lot of decay. It'd be like playing a John Philip Sousa march. Bum 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 bum. Got 3 accented notes there. They're accented because of the decay. If I don't decay, bum 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 ba 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 ba, they're just loud. They're not accented. But if I accent the way a jazz player would do it, we don't decay. We keep there's a certain level we never go below, and then we bump above, like this. I said tongue if I was accenting. I don't go down, which gets us in a lot of trouble with the loping kind of a line that doesn't have the connection, doesn't have the smoothness, legato that we need. So if a person, I often teach this to my students, if a person is tempted to slur, if a person is tempted to accent every upbeat, then replace that with a crescendo to where the next accent really is, which is going to be the top of the contour. If we accented the tops of the contours, they'll be asymmetrical and unpredictable. Some are on downbeat, some are on upbeats. Now it actually sounds like music. There's actually some phrasing there. So let's deal with triplets for a minute. Oh, here's one more thing for when you're dealing with 8-note lines. Sometimes there'll be a blue note. A blue note is typically a flat 3 or flat 5, possibly a flat 7. These are considered the blue notes, and it'll sound like it's a little bit bluesy. Those should always be inflected. There should be a little bend there. Let me illustrate that. I wouldn't play clean. So I need that extra bend on it. Give it a little soul. All right. That's running 8 notes. To review, we tongue upbeats sort of downbeats as the default mode. We have to tongue every upbeat. We can't slur more than 2 notes at a time. And I must accent the top notes of contours and not anywhere else. I do not accent all the upbeats or all the downbeats. Nothing methodical. Accents are asymmetrical. Let's move on to the second principle, which is how to handle triplets. Now with triplets, we can do more slurring. And in fact, the maximum amount of slurring is going to be from the note before the triplet to the note after the triplet. So you can actually have 5 notes under that slur. This doesn't happen very often. You can actually do this, but if you have the right situation, it works. And I'll show you why we can't always do it in just a moment. Let me illustrate, though. Here's an example where it could work. Slurred. So that actually works because there's no top notes of contours to get in the way. What usually happens, though, is that there'll be a top note of a contour. Often it's the note after the triplet. So I can slur the note before the triplet through the triplet, but I've got to tongue the note right after the triplet. So now there's only 4 notes under the slur. Yeah. So I can't go. No. The other situation is that the top note of the first note of the triplet may be the top note of the contour. So now I can tongue the note before the triplet, but I can't slur into the triplet. I've got to tongue the first note of the triplet. I can slur across the triplet and into the note after the triplet many times. Here'd be an example of that. In this case, this is on page 49. The G is the top note of the contour. I'm playing an A and back to the G, and you're saying, well, why isn't the A the top note of the contour, the middle note of the triplet? That's because it's just a decoration to the actual principal note of the melody. The first note of the triplet is the primary melody note, and so we treat that as the top note of the contour, not the decoration or the embellishment that goes up a note, even though it looks higher. If we have a lot of triplets in a row, we can actually slur all through the triplets. So here's an example, again on that same page. Or now I tongue the first note of each triplet. These are all very legato, all da tonguing. We never use T tonguing. The only time you use T tonguing is if you want to sound deliberately hokey. And there are times actually like that it's possible we might want to do that. But for normal jazz playing, we never use a T at the front of the note. We'll talk about it in a minute, that we do use T's at the ends of notes. We're going to use D at the beginning of all the notes, always legato. So I could slur all those triplets, or I could tongue lightly on the first note of each triplet, or tongue legato on the first note of each triplet. Let's move on to principle number 3, ghosting. A ghosted note is the lowest note of the contour. So I've got a note here, and a note here, and a note here in between, and it's going to be the ghosted note. Doodin-doo-dot. We often verbalize those ghosted notes as an N. Doodin, doodin-doo-dot. What a ghosted note really is simply a note that's softer than the notes that are around it. A ghosted note does not disappear. There's a lot of misunderstanding about ghosted notes. I had 2 students come in the same afternoon. Their band director had passed out that day the Sammy-Nessico chart called A Warm Breeze, and the line in the sax is boo-da, do-bao, de-dot, and those bottom notes of those contours are actually written as ghosted notes, which They often are not written. We just ghost them anyway. But if they're written, they have parentheses around them, or they might have an X head and even parentheses also. There's various ways it could be written. Well, they were going Buddha, da, Buddha, da, da. Wait a minute, what about those ghosted notes? Oh yeah, those are ghosted notes. Our band director told us not to play those. No, that's a misunderstanding. The ghosted notes are played. Why would we write them there if they aren't played? The ghosted notes are fingered. They have a tone. There's air that gets to them. They're almost always upbeats, and so we actually have to articulate them as well. It's just simply that they're softer. That's all. The best way to make those softer on some instruments, like the saxophone, is to use what I call an end tongue, or a half tongue. Bird used to use this a lot. Do, do, do. I'm actually doing that on the saxophone, where I'm muffling the sound with my tongue. I'm not blowing it at all different the whole time. It's the same. So it's a tonguing thing. It could also be done with pulling the jaw back. Because when I pull the jaw back, it mutes the note. I'm still blowing just as hard, but it gives me a dynamic effect. So I'm actually creating dynamics with either my tongue or my jaw, not my air. Surprise. Sometimes I will ghost. Oh, here's that same bird line with the lower notes ghosted. My tongue gets in the way a little bit, like that. Sometimes I'll ghost actually more than one note. In this case, so that the top notes really pop. So in slow motion. So those are the way, that's how I'm producing those ghosted notes. Ghosted notes still, as I say, have a sound, a tone. And while we're talking about slurring, we've talked about how to slur 8-note lines, how to slur triplets. All notes that are larger than an 8th note are always articulated, unless they're tied in it, as in a doo-wah, which I'll illustrate the doo-wahs here in a moment. All longer notes are tongued always. So if it's a quarter note, you're going to tongue it. If it's a half note, you're going to tongue it, unless it's in a doo-wah. Let's talk first, though, about the dot notes. Now, a dot note starts with a D, dot, and ends with the tongue, and it's fat. That ah part means it's dot. We'll talk about funk in another lesson. Dit. We use a different syllable, much shorter. So, the note is a square note. Now, let me just dispel a couple of false notions about this. Even though this marking, it's the vertical accent over a note, the TP type accent, even though that vertical marking is from the accent family, it has nothing to do with accenting. Those notes are frequently not accented, especially if they're in the middle of a line. If they're at the end of a line, they might justify an accent. They'll be accented only when it's warranted by the line itself, not because it's got that marking on it. The other thing I want to dispel is the notion that it's a short note. We often say, well, those are the short notes. They aren't. They're very frequently not that short. In fact, they're quite long sometimes. What determines the length of a dot note is the tempo. If it's a slow tempo, it'll be fatter. Dot, 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 da, dot. They're pretty long. They're not really that short. If it's a fast tempo, they're going to be much shorter. If it's in swing, they're going to be pretty fat. If it's in funk, they may be they will be much shorter, and many times they're shorter in the Latin chart as well. But it just totally depends on style and tempo. It has nothing to do with that marking. That has nothing to do with short. It has nothing to do with accent. The only thing that marking means is it's a square note. Now in classical music, we play round notes. With my classical students, I'm always asking for an M on the end of the note. Bom, bom. with the jazz, I want a square ending. But it ends square. We cut off the round ending. So there's a few things on dots. Where do we usually find dots? We're going to find them on when we have two eighth notes or any eighth note on the any upbeat. Say this better. Any upbeat in eighth note before a rest will be a dot. Any syncopated quarter note will be a dot. In fact, pretty much all quarter notes are dot. There is one exception to that. When you have a single downbeat quarter note, in other words, it's not syncopated, it's on the downbeat. There's only one of them. Now it can be either way. But otherwise, pretty much all quarter notes are short, and if it's syncopated, it's for sure short. The exceptions to that would be very rare. I'll just give you an example on this. These are on pages 51 in chapter 9. So here would be just the syncopated quarter note. Actually, that was a syncopated quarter note and the eighth note before a rest in one example. Here's an example of one downbeat note. This actually comes from a Sammy Nessigo chart. Ba 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 da bo ba da boo da do dot. I think he marks it long, and I like it long, but it would be equally valid to go ba da boo dot boo dot ba dot boo dot or ba dot boo da do dot. It works either way. Let me play those for you. So when it's on a downbeat like that, you can go either way. And I should mention this, that the very nature of the dot articulation does not permit slurring into it. It's common on the page to see a slur written into the dot marking. That is always incorrect. We never slur into a dot because then it's not dot. The D says I tongued it, I articulated it. So I'll give you two example of that. One where I slur into the dot, and the other one where I tongue the dot correctly. Again. Slurred. Of course, the second one is correct. I should mention here in the book I've got an example of this, that sometimes an exception to this is on page 52. Sometimes when I have a chain of syncopations, it could go either way. So that I could play the whole chain long or the whole chain short. Probably the first choice would be short, but sometimes it just makes more sense that the whole chain should be long. Let me illustrate it both ways. Here's short and then long. Kind of depends on the nature of the chart, which one might be the best. When we have chains of downbeat quarter notes, then we typically play them dot. And we will also typically accent the notes that are on 2 and 4. Let me play this line. All right. And while we're talking about dots, let's talk about the note that comes before the dot. We may not slur into the note before the dot. The note before the dot is always do. It's long, but it is tongued. Do dot. This is kind of the transliteration of bebop. This is the convention that gave the language its name, really, bebop. Bebop. If I go bop. No, I've got to have more articulation than that, and I've got to tongue the note. I've got to articulate the note before the bop. B, B. Now, B's and P's don't mean anything to the mouth, to the wind player, because they're lip syllables. Our lips are busy. We've got to have these be tongue syllables. So the B becomes the do, the D, and the P becomes the T. We can do those with the tongue. So do dot is like bebop. I've got to have the B or the do before the dot. So here would be an example of that. Actually, that's not the dot, not the example. I guess I don't have an example of that written here, do I? Well, let me make one up. Not. I need that do dot, not ah dot on the end. So that's another principle. Now, here's one other thought along this lines. If I have such as a dotted quarter note, then I've got to shape this so that the dot comes out with a little more punch in that situation. So here's example with where I shape it slightly down at the end of the note, and then one where I blow right into it. Or if I blow right into it, it doesn't have the same punch. So there's a full power on almost the whole length of the note, and then a very quick dip, just a slight decay, in other words, just before the dot. Doesn't stop, there's not a space. Sometimes we do a space in a certain situation. For example, or those little cutoffs with the tongue will make the band sound really precise. You get everybody in the band doing that, it'll really clean up. There are times when that's maybe not appropriate, but most of the time it would be. You have to, the way you understand how to use these things is by listening. I can give you all these principles, and if you never listen to any jazz, it will all fall short. And the same for your students. I'm giving you some principles to kind of give you a head start, but you've got to do the listening to understand how these things are used and when. And then you build up an intuition from your listening as to, this is not the place for that, or this is a place for the opposite choice. All right, let's talk about doo-wahs. Doo-wahs are of three types. The first type is what I call the classic doo-wah, where the do is a lower note to the wah, which is a higher note. First of all, I need to say that the way you recognize a doo-wah on the paper is the upbeat eighth note is tied to a longer note value than itself. If it's tied to the same note value, in other words, an eighth note tied to an eighth note, that's now a syncopated quarter note, and the appropriate articulation will be dot. But if it's tied to a longer value, then we never can do a dot on anything longer than a quarter note. And by the way, dot is the same whether it's on the eighth note of the quarter note or whatever it's on. Dot is dot. It's not like staccato in classical music, where we say that the staccato is half the value of the note, and therefore a staccato quarter note is not as short as the staccato eighth note, is not as short as the staccato 16th note. Well, that's not how it is with dot in jazz, because it always could be written different ways. Dot is dot, and if it's on an eighth note, it's the same length and fatness as if it's on a quarter note. Because I could have written that eighth note tied to another eighth note anytime I wanted to. So let me just illustrate the doo-wahs. We've got an upbeat eighth note tied to a longer note, and then we've got the note, that's the wah, and the note before that on the downbeat is the do. Now, doo-wah is actually a dynamic effect. The do is soft or smothered. The wah is suddenly loud. It's like what the brass do with their hand in the bell. Boo bop, doo wah, where the do is closed and smothered a little bit, and the wah is suddenly open and louder. Doo wah, it's really a dynamic effect. That, of course, does nothing on the saxophone, and brass players also need to be able to do this without using their hand and the bell. So doo wah would be softer, louder. Best way to do that on the saxophone, pull the jaw back on the do. I'm blowing just the same. I'm not blowing less. I'm blowing just as hard the whole time. I'm doing the dynamics with my jaw. Getting the dynamics from my jaw, actually. The air is constant, solid the whole time. So now back to the three types of doo-wahs. The first type is what I call the classic, and that's where the do is, like I say, is the lower note and the wah is the higher note. So it'd be like this. These examples are on page 54. So I'm pulling the jaw back on the G. I'm blowing like this. The whole way the same. And so here's the example of the classic doo-wah. The whole way I'm going, I'm blowing just the same the whole time. It's just my jaw pulling back that's making that one note softer. So that would be the first type of doo-wah. It is not a pitch bending effect. We do not lip the wah. Is there a slight pitch thing in there? There is kind of a slight pitch aberration. That's why we call it wah, wah. But it's not being caused by me lipping it. My jaw in this case is going back and forth, back and forth. It's not going back and down and forth and up. I'm not lipping. I'm only playing soft to loud. The fact is that when we change dynamics dramatically in a jazz situation, that in a classical situation, in a wind situation, any kind of wind situation, when we change dynamics, we change pitch. Most of the time we are compensating for that pitch change with embouchure or oral cavity things. In this case, we don't have time to compensate, nor do we want to. And so by going from very soft to very loud, there's a slight pitch thing that happens just from the dynamic change because I'm not compensating for it. It is not a lipping thing. When you lip it, it sounds immature. Now let me deal with the second class of doo-wah. This is a this is when the do is higher than the wah. This is sometimes happens as well, and when the do is higher, you're saying, wait a minute, it's the top note of the contour, it needs to be punched. Yes, it does. So in this case, I'm not going to play the do softer than the wah. I'm going to play it punched. I'm going to punch both notes, the do and the wah. I'm going to put a very slight decay in between the do and the wah so that the wah gets more punch. Do-wah, do, do-wah, do-wah. Let me illustrate that. Do-wah. If I did slow motion. The third category of doo-wah is when the do and the wah are the same pitch. In this case, I may do a little pitch. You kind of do, do-wah, do-wah. Example. I really can do this without lipping. I can do it just going back and forth. Ba, wah, wah, wah. But I can also, in this situation, put a little bit of a bend, downward bend, back and back up. What I find with the students is that they always do the doo-wah they do the dip too quickly. So it'll sound like this, and then it won't swing. That's the wrong rhythm. It should be swinging, so I have to delay where I put that dip. That lets the wah come in a swing position in the rhythm instead of an even eighth note position. I should mention this about the doo-wah. Sometimes it does look like a do-dot. And I've written an example of this again at the bottom of page 54. I've got a line that goes do-boo-doo-wah, but then it keeps going. Do-boo-doo-wah, ba-doo-wah, ba-doo-wah, boo-doo-dot. Somehow, I mean, written, if I just literally took the rules that I'm giving you, then I would be going do-doo-doo-dot, do-doo-dot, do-doo-dot, do-doo-dot. I think intuitively it's more melodic. Do 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 ah, do do ah. So I justify this as saying that this is actually a do wah, but it has an afterthought. It's like do 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 wah. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you do do wah. Do do do. Oh, do do wah. So I set it up as a do wah, but then I come back in. Let me illustrate that. That would be a valid choice, but I think it's not as good for me. I like doo-wah in this case, so it's a doo-wah with an afterthought. Here's one other thing that I call bois. I guess technically I should call it dwa, but it's when I have a dotted quarter note on an upbeat. It's kind of a kick beat. When the music accompanied dancing a lot, that would be where the dancer is suddenly, wah. Let me show you what a bois sounds like. That dotted quarter note. Ba boo doo da bwa da boo doo da. It comes mostly from punch, but I also start with my jaw slightly back and then push it forward. Do boo doo da bwa bwa. The pitch, we arrive at pitch almost instantaneously. It's quite immediate. I don't want da boo doo da bwa da. It's not a big bend. It's just a bwa boo doo da bwa bwa. We do slide into the note a little bit there. It gives it more vocal character, a little more punch, a little more soul, I think. So when I have upbeat dotted quarter notes, especially after a rest, but either way it can happen that I want that bwa. Or dwa, I guess I should call it dwa. What if I have repeated pitches on the same note? In other words, do boo doo boo dot. Classical or jazz, this always implies a crescendo. Do boo doo boo dot. There's got to be some direction happening there. In jazz, I often accent the second note. Boo ba boo dot, boo ba boo dot, and then crescendo. Boo ba boo dot. Illustrate that. Or a little more punch there. How do we handle long notes? Typically, we sting them with the sforzando and then crescendo, whether they're written or not. So this is now on page 55, an example. Once more. So, illustrate one more thing that we want that punch. We've got to be percussive. We're always punching. I've got some other videos that working with the whole band, I think, where we illustrate playing with more punch and more percussiveness. I've got another video, too, that deals with the last part of this chapter on warm-ups. I think those videos can take care of that. I do mention here at the end that sometimes when you're rehearsing charts, it's helpful to have the students verbalize the articulation. There's not one way to do all these do, do, do. When I'm doing eighth notes consecutively with that tongue, the upbeat, sort of the downbeat thing, and I'm trying to verbalize that, do, 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 you know, I could have do, do, or do, 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 dot. Sometimes we'll use the syllable day, which gives a little bit more punch on a do, 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 dot. I want to use that on a top note of a contour, for example. So this is an example on page 58, bottom of 58. Do, 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 day, do, 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 day, do, day, da, do, ah. That's how I'd verbalize that. On the next page, this illustrates some ghosted notes. Do, 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 dot, 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 do, do, ah. I'll often have the band verbalize the syllables. We literally want these syllables to come out the horn. So I think that probably I have left some sheets here at the end of these principles that you can give to your students, that you can duplicate freely and give to your students. I would like to say that I've illustrated these from a saxophone standpoint. In dealing with a lot of my brass playing friends, they say, yeah, I can do the same kinds of things on my brass instrument. A note needs to be made about trombone players, probably, because trombone players can only do very few slurs where they have kind of a natural break. They can do a slur occasionally, but typically they're going to tongue every note, and they have to get used to be able to go do 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 and make the effect of that, that same effect as a saxophone player or a trumpet player, but they're still tonguing. When they get fast, it's an issue. Some players can single tongue quite fast. Some players go to double tonguing. When I played with Andy Martin, for example, he told me that he never double tongues. He only plays do da da. I mean, he single tongues every note. It's amazing that he can do that fast. A lot of players, Bob Nick Chesney's the master of doodle tonguing. He's published a book called Doodle Tonguing, doodle 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 doodle, where you can actually do that on the saxophone too. Had a good friend, Jim Carroll, played with Woody Herman's band, and Jim could doodle tongue like crazy on the saxophone. There are different ways of handling that with the trombone, doodle or double or even single if you're fast enough. But you have to kind of simulate the same kinds of things that we've been talking about. The brass players all have to simulate all the effects that we've been talking about. And I might say that these effects were basically set up by Charlie Parker. We hear it in his playing. We imitate his playing. He doesn't just affect saxophone players. He affects players of every instrument. And so we have to recognize that we've got to simulate what it sounds like on the saxophone. So I don't feel all bad about illustrating it on the saxophone. Anyway, I think we should take a break. I'm going to come back with some chapter 10 materials on, okay, how do we now apply some of these ideas to other styles? So let's sign off for now. Watch some of the other videos where we illustrate these articulation principles and warm-ups with the whole ensemble. Thanks.